Good morning. Welcome to February, Tuesday, the 1st of February. We continue the story following the reading from Genesis. Today we read Genesis chapter 21, verses 1 to 21. And it continues the story of Abraham and Sarah and the promise that God has given them that they will have a child. And in the reading today, it is in fact the birth of Isaac, the firstborn to Sarah. It will be the second child of Abraham, but that's because Abraham and Sarah had colluded that Abraham would have a child by Hagar, the slave girl or handmaiden to Sarah. That practice fairly common in those days, but it was not what God wanted. And so God persisted in God's plan and in God's timing. And we spoke last week about God's timing being somewhat different to ours. In God's timing, Isaac is born, and it is quite obviously, patently a miraculous birth, because Abraham, we are told, is some 100 years old when Isaac is born. Sarah may be just a year or two younger, but certainly very, very old, way beyond what any human would expect to be age-wise when you have your child, certainly your first child. And interestingly, scripture plays a little joke because Isaac means, loosely translated, he laughs. And both Abraham and Sarah had laughed when God told them that they would have a child at this old dotage. And even Sarah actually acknowledges after Isaac is born, and she says, all will be happy for me, or all will laugh with me, rejoice with me, because of the birth of this child. So I think God definitely wanted them to have a child, Isaac. The line of scripture through to Christ would follow from that line and only that line. And so Abraham and Sarah colluding to have Ishmael born from Hagar was outside of God's plan. But God in his grace did acknowledge that Ishmael was a son to Abraham and would protect him. Anyway, back to the story. Isaac is born. There is a celebration when he is weaned. Weaning for a young infant would take place between 2 and 3 years of age. That was the custom in the ancient Near East. And Sarah at that festivity has noticed or becomes jealous of Ishmael. Scripture seems to indicate that Ishmael, who by this stage would be a very late year teenager, a young adult, probably, by no doubt, a strapping young man, quite competent, but his mocking attitude towards this little infant, Isaac, upsets Sarah. And so she orders Abraham to throw out the child and the mother, Hagar, and to simply send them on their way into the wilderness. And Abraham does not want to do that because it was not the practice and the custom to simply disinherit someone like Ishmael, and to certainly throw them out into the wilderness. Perhaps the slave girl Hagar, yes, tough as that was, but certainly not this son born from your own loins. And so Abraham is greatly distressed by this. But God comes to Abraham and says, do not be distressed. This is in fact what I want you to do. But do not fear, I will be with Hagar and Ishmael, and I will protect them. And as I promised before, Ishmael will himself become the father of a great nation. That nation obviously appears frequently in Scripture. It's a nation with a degree of resentment against the Jews, and I think perhaps we even see that still to this day. God's line and God's purpose and history for the world does not go through the line of Ishmael, but through the line of Isaac. And we notice again that it's as if God speaks to Abraham the day before or that night, and Scripture says very early the next morning. In other words, immediately Abraham does what he does. He responds in faith and does what God asks him to do. And that's not a sign of being laissez-faire, it's taken as a sign of faith. And we talked about this last week and before, and asked the question, do you and I have that same level of faith? So Hagar and Ishmael are sent off. They are obviously greatly distressed. This is going against many of the rules and the interpretation of the rules for the time, which says, of course, that there are lots of other people around and there are communities and there are written rules. And in fact, archaeologists have discovered those rules, and so much of what Abraham and Sarah do, and when they do things wrong, can be seen in those rules. Not the story of Abraham and Sarah, but the story of why they did certain things. And God meets with Hagar, and he promises Hagar, just as he had promised Abraham, that Ishmael would not only survive, but thrive. And you see that taking place in Scripture. How obedient are we to God? And are we willing to trust that even though sometimes very terrible things will happen to us, to acknowledge that nevertheless God is in control? And we trust to God that God will cause us not only to survive, but to thrive, most especially if we are following the way of God in faith. Folks, have a wonderful day. We'll chat again tomorrow. God bless.